Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
A frostbitten podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 147, The Icepod Cometh.
Yes, it is finally here. Winter, my favorite.
Yeah, this is going to be fun because Alex and I are coming at this from very different angles of attack.
Yeah, you're Heat Miser and I'm the Ice Guy. I don't remember his name.
Jack Frost? I don't know.
What's the... It's from that one movie.
I know what you're talking about. I don't remember what the other one...
Snow Miser.
Snow Miser, and then there's Meister Burger Meister.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm Snow Miser in this scenario, and you are Heat Miser, and that is the dichotomy in which we are approaching this at, but I'm also not do something stupid and die on a mountain miser, so...
See, that's going to be part of this, because I'm the rock climber, and I feel like I might have thought in my brain that I could do something stupid like this, but now I won't. So this pod has been very useful. These films have been very useful.
No. Could you imagine somebody with a child doing something as risky as trying to climb Mount Everest in the 90s?
Oh, boy.
Could you imagine
I can't imagine now, as of this month. So here's what we're talking about, guys. We're talking about films in which people are about to die in very cold situations. I don't know what kind of genre that is, but that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's essentially it's a survival genre, right?
Yeah,
but
it's a very subset of survival.
It's normally. I mean, survival genres are normally broken out. I guess there's a lot of horror survival out there too, but for the most part, it tends to be like based up almost on biome. Like, are you stranded in the desert on an island? In the snow, and we're doing in the snow. Mm-hmm. That's the idea here. As
my siblings have pointed out very astutely, anyone who's been watching alone will get a kick out of this episode, because that's kind of what we're talking about. Are you familiar with the show? I started watching that. Yeah, I started watching it, and I kind of fell off of it pretty quick. But like, I totally see the connections. So to preface this, here's what we're going to be talking about. We're talking about people, they're very cold. So here are some vocab words. Hypothermia. Hypothermia is when your core body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's not that as cold as I thought it was going to be.
I know. I actually thought that too.
Like your body temperature is normally what, like 97 to 99 or something?
Yeah.
So like that's not pretty
that narrow range. Yeah. There's also, actually, I don't have the definition of frostbite. Let's do that.
Well, frostbite is when like your like cells literally start dying, right? Mm-hmm. Like just on your body, like they don't get enough blood flow, so they just turn. You're like a frostbite turns like that area of your body black because all of the skin just dies right there.
Yeah, which typically begins at your extremities, fingers, toes, even nose. And then we also have hypoxia, which is a loss of air in your blood, in your brain, which causes things like discombobulation and hallucinations and stuff like that.
Yeah,
also
especially
not
when
good
you're so
if you
high
go,
up that you can't. There's less oxygen.
Right. So these things are not good. They're not good for people surviving. They are also things that are very prevalent if you climb very tall mountains. Or if you happen to be stranded, which actually we have inadvertently structured this episode pretty evenly, pretty poetically between accidental
because we're so good
survival.
At being podcasters.
That's right. That's what we need to hear. Subliminal messaging. So we have accidental survival. We have intentional survival, more or less intentional, not like alone. But yeah, people like to do things like climb mountains. People like to climb too high on mountains, which is where these bad things happen to your body. Also, planes occasionally crash. Planes occasionally crash in places that are not ideal for survival. So these are the things that we're talking about. I don't really know how to set up this episode more than that, because that's really all it's going to come down to. Also, how are we telling stories around this?
Yeah, it's like this really interesting... One, it's interesting to explore this part of humanity, which makes us do this crazy stuff like go to these places in the first place, just because it's just built into humanity, I guess, to do some crazy stuff. And this is the kind of, we're going to be talking about the kind of people who find themselves at the edges of society and at the extreme points in the world. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that we were originally just talking about doing another Christmas episode, and we didn't want to do more Christmas movies, so we're doing this instead. So, ho, ho, ho.
We've already done a Christmas episode about the end of the world, so we're taking it a step back, at least from that.
Yeah, we did. We did end of the year, end of the world.
Yeah.
So there was that. But yeah, we're going to be talking about people doing some stuff that to most people sounds pretty insane, and is definitely very risky. So yeah, let's get into those individual films, shall we?
Let's do it. First up, we're talking about Touching the Void from 2003, directed by Kevin MacDonald, based on the book by Joe Simpson, which is based on true events, his actual experiences, because it's a documentary. Starring Simon Yates, who is in the film. Each of these are themselves in the film, and they're also in reenactments with actors. So yeah. Simon Yates, also portrayed by Nicholas Aaron. Joe Simpson, as himself, also portrayed by Brendan Mackey. Richard Hawking, portrayed by Ollie Ryall. And cinematography is by Mike Ellie and Keith Partridge, which is appropriate for a Christmas episode.
Is he in a pear tree? I don't remember any pear trees in that movie.
He's
but anyway.
Peru mountain tree.
A Peru tree. And then we'll be talking about The Grey from 2011, directed by Joe Carnahan. Also written by Joe Carnahan with the help of Ian Mackenzie Jeffers, based on the short story Ghostwalker by Ian Mackenzie Jeffers, starring Liam Neeson, Frank Grillo, Dermot Mulroney, Dallas Roberts, and Nonzo Anolzi. Cinematography by Masanobu Takayanagi.
Nice. We'll be following that with Everest from 2015, directed by Baltazar Kormaker, written by William Nicholson and Simon Beaufoy, which is also based on true events, and it's also the events that are described in the book Into Thin Air, which was also adapted into a movie. This story has actually been made into at least 3 movies now. Yes. We'll get into all that. Yep. Starring Jason Clarke, Josh Brolin, Emily Watson, Jake Gyllenhaal, and a cast of other actors.
There's so many people. Yeah. There's
cinematography
a lot of people.
By Salvatore Totino.
Honestly, too many people. That's one of the points of the movie.
Yeah. It almost becomes like one of those war movies. Every time we talk about a war movie and we're like, once those white guys put their helmets on, I just don't know who's who.
Yeah.
Is the same thing.
Once all these people put their ski suits on, I mean, they try to like color code them with different like cold weather gear, but like also, They
do a good job of making sure you know who Jake Gyllenhaal is, because
it's Jake Gyllenhaal. He's kind of hard to miss. Then finally, we'll be talking about Arctic from 2018, a film I first saw when it debuted at the Pasadena Film Festival. Directed by Joe Pena, written by Joe Pena and Ryan Morrison, and starring Mads Mikkelsen, Maria Thelma Sarmadorter, and Trintrinai Tikausk. I apologize if I missaid that.
Those are literally the only 3 people in this film.
With the arrangements of that, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess there's some people at the end, but they're probably
you don't see their faces.
Yeah, they don't see their faces. They could be the same other 2 people, just moved. And finally, cinematography by Thomas Orn Tomasson. Lots of Scandinavians involved in that one, which honestly makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And then there's Joe Pena.
Yeah. And you know, the famous, very Scandinavian name, Joe Pena. Anyway, it could be Scandinavian, but probably not. Anyway, let's jump into it. Touching the Void from 2003. Jason, take it away.
Touching the Void from 2003. In 1985, 2 climbers, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, successfully climbed the previously unclimbed west face of Ciudad Grande in the Peruvian Andes. Descending via the north face turns into an epic and deadly adventure when icy and stormy weather sets in, causing multiple disasters that threaten to overwhelm the victorious mountaineers.
Oh boy, what a one to start off with, Alex. This one is so intense.
This one's, it's intense. Honestly, it's not like the cleanest presentation, but it's very effective.
Yeah.
I kind of want to start there. Oh, it really sent me back to our documentary episode where we were talking about some different styles of documentary. Mm-hmm. One of the ones we talked about was the Earl Morris reenactment style.
Yes.
Like the Thin Blue Line. And this is that style. It is talking heads combined with a reenactment. Some of the reenactment acting might be considered a little hammy, but that's fine.
The reenactment scenarios themselves were stinking impressive because they had actual mountain climbers.
Did it?
Yeah, doing real mountain climbing.
Explains maybe why they were so hammy, because they were focusing more on getting people who could do this crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And less on subtlety of their expression while performing in the middle of a blizzard on a mountain.
Or like, how do you yell when your lower leg has literally forced its way through your upper leg?
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. Some of the injuries they talk about are really intense here.
Yeah.
Really intense. Yeah. And then the talking heads they're good. They're not very charismatic people. I will say that.
No, but it's interesting. And this is, so this one being our only true documentary, I do want to touch on that because I am just really fascinated with documentary theory for whatever reason. So
because you're a docu-nerd.
I'm a docu-nerd. So we have these talking heads. They interviewed each of the three people involved. There's only three people. Two guys go to a mountain. They meet one other guy. So it's first of all, where do we start with this? The way that documentaries work is you always have to think about who is telling the story and who is crafting the story. So we have these people telling their story, events that happen to them, to us, to the audience, through the filmmaker. But the filmmaker is crafting this. So the way in which he decides to reveal information is important. The ways in which he chooses to use the reenactment, the instances when he decides to use each of the talking heads, because first of all, they're both telling the same story. So when he chooses to use which person matters, when he chooses to show us their faces matters. And it's really interesting because like putting together the trailer for this episode and watching the trailer for this, there's a little bit of deception in the marketing.
Oh,
because
for sure.
Surprisingly, this ended up being, and I guess this is spoilers, but it's not going to diminish the effect of watching this film at all. But this ended up being a pretty heartwarming kind of a story. Like it's the story of endurance. The fact that both the guys are in there tells you already that they didn't die, but the stuff that they go through is insane. But
it's almost
the marketing,
body horror.
The marketing makes it out to be this story of like utter betrayal and like the worst thing ever, which is also interesting too, because they make a point in the documentary to say that this story became almost a legend within the climbing community.
Oh yeah. The one guy is not welcome in the British climbing community anymore.
Yeah. So the pivotal point in the film, and again, we're kind of getting into spoilers, so you can go find this film if you want to. It's in certain library streaming sites like Canopy and whatever. But the pivotal point is this point where Simon has to cut the line on Joe, whose leg is broken, and he's hanging off a cliff, and he's about to drag them both over the edge of the cliff. And so Simon cuts the line so that at least one of them survives. They both end up surviving. Again, it's insane.
It really is crazy that Joe survives this.
But they build it up as
absolutely unreal.
As if this is like an intentional, like malicious thing done by him, which it's not. And they do a really good job too. So they propagate it and then they flip the tables on us, which is part of what building this story is. Because at the beginning, you have a lot of comments, like even from the other guy, Richard, and he's saying like, oh yeah, I didn't like Joe. He was mean to me. He was more mean to me than Simon was. And so now you're like...
Did Richard come across as a little creepy to you?
He did. He had this weird detachment.
Yeah.
Like the whole time.
He seemed like maybe the other two guys were definitely in Peru to climb the mountain, but Richard seemed like he might have been there because he was hiding out because the British police were onto him for being a serial killer or something like that.
He was also smiling throughout the entire interview, which is also why it's interesting when they choose to show their faces. Like, what expression are they giving when they're talking?
Oh yeah. No, that's a solid point in terms of like documentary construction, because you do shape your narrative in the editing room with documentary. Like this, there are some strong choices made here, and we don't necessarily know what the other options were because we haven't seen that footage. And also, like, I kind of get why they had to do what they did to build it up to be as dramatic and emotionally involved, because both of the climbers seem pretty detached in just their telling on its own, and neither of them seem very. I didn't get a lot of emotion even when they were talking about the betrayal. They didn't seem mad at each other, you know?
Yeah, they also didn't seem super buddy either. And that's another thing that's interesting, like in terms of keeping the story to a concise retelling of this one event, we get no backstory, which I kind of started gnawing at me by the end of the film. It's like, I don't know the relationship
how these guys know each other
between Joe and Simon. We do get at the end that like Joe defended Simon. He still defends Simon. Like, I would have done what he did. He's not mad at him, but there's this weird like missing link in what their relationship is. It's a very, I don't know, kind of pragmatic relationship. Yeah.
It's almost like intentional. It feels intentionally incomplete.
Yeah.
And then when you leave, because you can't tell everything in a documentary, but certainly here you feel you feel those items missing, those parts of the story, and that leaves you wondering about what those things could be, or something like that. It almost feels like, to some extent, some people are just being polite, but also you don't get a lot of other emotion coming through because both of these guys are pretty stone-faced. But yeah, it's curious to wonder about what else could have been there.
Yeah.
But I will say, on that other point you made, I am impressed with how concise this story is compared to the other three. Like, this is a really tight, like the story takes place over the course of like an hour, maybe less.
But it still takes its time. So actually, the film is an hour and 45 minutes. And it is interesting, too, because you could tell it faster, but they take time where they need to. Like, there's some stuff that just for the audience to really get a sense of, like, this is a crazy thing that Joe had to do, where he's inside this cavern and he's like, well, I'm not getting out the top, so either I sit here and freeze to death or I just see where the bottom is. And, like, you have to just get into his mindset, which again, I think part of the weird lack of emotion on the part of the storytellers, and also the lack of context, it sort of creates this blank slate where all you're left with is like, what happened? And you start putting your own mindset into the story. Like, what would I do if I was in that situation?
It definitely invites the audience to be active participants,
which
is a good way to make it engaging when you don't have a lot of very active emotional hooks besides just that very cold survival mode thing that you have going on, because there is that stake, which is survival. And it is impressive how much they are able to string out what is a play-by-play of near-death experiences into a coherent hour and 45 minute long narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And incorporating that with the visuals, which are not, again, I think the fact that they're not like, and the other thing is like looking up this film online, every poster for this film is terrible. It looks like some really bad Photoshop job. And so I was expecting the reenactments to be just the cheesiest things ever. And like you said, the acting isn't great, but also it's still kind of that blank slate. But the situations are real. Like the terrain that they're shooting on is for real. And so you really get kind of immersed in the climbing experience of this mountain. And man, the scale, like just the scale when they do those zoom outs and you're seeing them climbing halfway up the mountain and then you see the entire mountain is nuts.
Yeah, it really puts you, especially when you consider how the vast majority of people, the crushing majority of people, I'd say, will never find themselves in a situation like this.
Yeah.
That really does serve to kind of put you in that mindset. I do wonder, though, if you are a mountain climber, do you watch stuff like this or do you avoid it at all costs?
Yeah. It's also interesting, like climbing documentaries just seem to be getting more and more popular.
Climbing
as
itself
climbing
has gotten
does
more and more popular. Yeah, we'll talk about that and the commercialization of climbing a lot once we get to Everest. But it has, in a lot of places, kind of become a problem. And it's very much an exasperation, almost to a hyperbolic point of the problems faced by the people in Everest, but to a very large extent.
Yeah.
But yeah, climbing has gotten more popular especially, and I think Instagram and other social media sites have kind of played a role in this as travel and kind of like FOMO culture has become bigger as well. And everyone wants to be on the trending hashtag van life or hashtag climb Everest life.
Well, that's kind of what I was going to say too, just in terms of the popularity of climbing movies is because most people will never climb the Peruvian Andes.
Because they don't have a death wish.
They don't have a death wish, hopefully. At least
even
not,
the people who successfully complete this, I believe, have some of that like that Freudian like death wish thing going on, like a little bit. Like you want to dance with the devil a little bit if you're doing this kind of thing.
Not to mention, most people with a death wish aren't going to fly themselves to Peru and put themselves through this. But there is kind of this. There's a voyeurism aspect to it, right? It's like this is as close as I'm going to get. So yeah, let me experience it through your eyes, and then oh wow, I'm so much smarter than you for not.
There is that aspect of it. I got that in all of these movies.
Yeah.
It's, you know what it's very similar to? It's very similar to watching, we already mentioned body horror, but it's very similar to watching a horror movie where you're like looking at watching the characters just do dumb stuff that gets them dead. And like you're watching it, but it's also real people doing stuff. It's very much real life horror, but the thing that'll kill you is gravity and the cold.
Yeah. Which is such it's such an unexciting way to die, but it's
truly terrifying.
It's one of those things that the fact that you don't think about it that much, it makes it all that more dangerous.
Yeah. Like the way that when people do die in these films, I guess the gray excluded, but the way people die in most of these films today when they do die is like terrifyingly cold, alone, with no hope. Maybe you're going insane, you're freezing to death, you're running out of oxygen. Like truly a terrifying way to die. Like, and
they build that up in this film because Joe gets so close to that. And he just literally white knuckles his way through it. But you get the full sense of you either sit here and you just wait and see how long it takes you to freeze to death and stop breathing, or you just keep moving and do whatever you can. And I think that's what this film kind of brings to this collection of films that we're talking about, which is, it's just the sheer endurance of it. And this is going to actually tie into Arctic probably. Well, yeah, and the gray, but it's that when you're down to it, you just do everything that you possibly can. You just, what's the next thing? And even that point where he's gotten out of the glacier and he's like, oh great, now I have to hike 20 miles back to camp with a broken leg, and he hasn't eaten in like 2 days. And
where he's like licking the rocks.
Yeah, but he's just like, if I can get to that rock in 20 minutes, I'll be happy. And then if it's 22 minutes, he's just mad at himself. So he's like, I'm going to get to that rock in 20 minutes. And these are like the mental games that he's playing just to keep himself moving, to the point where he also describes like literally having two halves of his brain. One half is like, I should just like lay here and never get up. And the other half is like, but I have to get to that rock in the next 6 minutes or I'm going to miss my time. Like there's such a good job of putting us in that place.
The psychology of survival, which hopefully you have not personally experienced. I hope you, dear listener, have not experienced that and won't. But yes, yeah. And to what you were talking about earlier, like again, like getting a real dose of that in a world in which you probably have not experienced that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah,
and then the sheer makeup of just how messed up you get from frostbite and stuff, which in the reenactments, it's all, like I said, makeup. But it's something that after watching Touching the Void, I distinctly noticed in like the gray and Arctic is missing. Is like if you're that cold and you're like maybe can build a fire every few hours, like you're getting frostbite. Like things are happening to you that don't play well in a fictional setting. And those are, we're going to talk about, much more thematic, almost like parables, but still like the reality of being in cold temperatures for that long is not pretty.
No, I think you see isn't Mickelson like missing a toe or two?
Yeah, he's missing a toe. That's right.
Yeah, but that's the kind of the most they kind of really show you of frostbite in that movie. And then there's a lot of polar bear, but that's for a later discussion. Yeah. Yeah, this is an intense movie. It's definitely not the highest production value in the world, but it's very effective with what it has at its disposal. You know, we've talked about before.
And really what it's bringing to the table is real experience.
Yeah, yeah. And we've talked about almost ad nauseum how when you make a movie, regardless of your budget, you have to pick what you're going to focus on. And this movie does it really well. You know, it doesn't have the best acting, but it has impressive locations. It's very realistic locations because they are real. You know, it's got a very real story and it focuses on forefronting that. And it's not front loading or, you know, foregrounding anything that is not its strong suit. It's letting that stuff kind of sit at the back. And if you want to get nitpicky, you can nitpick it. But the effective stuff is there. It's a lean, it's mean, it's a movie machine. I like it.
There you go. That goes on the cover of the DVD from now on. All right. Well, that being said, let's move on to one of our fictional accounts for the day.
Very Jason, fictional.
Why don't you set up The Gray for us?
The Gray from 2011. John Otway works as a hunter in Alaska, hired by oil companies to keep their workers safe in the frozen wilderness. After the plane he's on with fellow oil workers crashes, Otway discovers he and the survivors are stranded deep in wolf territory, and it's up to him to get them out alive.
All right, Jonathan. I want to tell you, before we get started, I want to tell you my interpretation of the movie, because this is so thematic and metaphorical. My interpretation of this movie, and the whole time I watched it, was that it was almost like Lost. I think they all died in the plane crash, and essentially what we're seeing is like a fairy tale like odyssey through purgatory, as they all kind of slowly accept death or their own mortality.
You're talking about Lost specifically.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, yeah, but
right. It's similar.
In this movie, yeah. So as you move through, the characters either accept death or get ripped into death forcibly, and slowly over the course of the movie, everyone succumbs to it until even our main character, who is fighting with the will to survive, as we see at the beginning, because he almost commits suicide before he crashes in the plane, finally gives in to death at the very end, but in his own way, which is swinging with glass in his
knuckles.
Fists.
Yeah.
That was my interpretation of it.
I mean, yeah. So the point is that the film is, again, speaking of kind of streamlined, not maybe in terms of runtime or anything, but like the elements of the story are very simple. We have a plane crash, we have a group of people trying to survive, and we have maybe 3 or 4 things out to get them. First of all is whatever residual wounds from the plane crash. We have wolves. We have the cold.
Not just regular wolves either, like horror movie monster wolves.
Arctic wolves. I was actually concerned for you, Alex, because of the number of wolves that are like killed and stabbed in this film. Were you okay?
I was a little worried that I was going to be upset, but the wolves don't really come across as very real to me.
Yeah.
Like they almost have superpowers.
Yeah. So that's the thing.
You could have replaced these wolves with like alien monsters. Right. And like you would have basically had the same effect.
But so I watched this film like back in high school whenever it came out. And I didn't think that much. I wasn't thinking very hard about it. But I mean, now that we're in podcast land and we're overthinking simple films, the wolves become a mirror for the people, right? Like Liam Neeson becomes the alpha wolf of the group. And I was actually surprised at how quickly there was Liam Neeson describing they hear the howling in the darkness. And Liam Neeson is like, that was the alpha. I'm not going to be able to do his gruff Irish accent, so I'm not going to try.
That was the alpha, or something like that.
Yeah, see, we both tried. That didn't work. So he's like, that was the alpha. He just had to put down this challenger. This challenger came to take over the alpha. And then like 5 minutes later, the jackweed dude is like, who put you in charge? Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to stab you. And Liam Neeson has to literally take him down and put a knife to his throat and reassert his dominance. And I was like, oh, okay, that was not very subtle. But I mean, you get the point.
This is not a subtle movie. No. I will say
it's like reducing. It's like once you've stripped everything else away, I think part of the point of this film is once you've stripped everything else away, you're left with a certain primality. You're left with these group dynamics and hierarchies that are very animalistic, right? And you're left with whatever will you can muster to survive. But they do have elements that, humanize the group of characters that we're following. They have the moment where they're all sharing their memories. They have moments where, they stop and are trying to muster some amount of reverence for those that have died. And they're trying to figure out, why did they die and I didn't, and all that kind of stuff. So it's these little elements of like, what is our relationship with those that we experience life with that makes our lived experience worth experiencing?
Yeah. I do like that angle of them trying to cling to their humanity even as they try to survive. Because as we can see, like trying to survive can often require you to abandon a lot of tenets of humanity. And you kind of lose that really quick. And as you do what you have to survive, I kind of wish there was a little more focus on that balance, because oftentimes when we're just like focusing on the characterization of the other people in the group, I just don't like any of them. I don't know why. I just found a lot of them really like blandly written and boring or annoying, or like whoever was writing them was too hopped up on Monster Energy and like watched X Games a lot. It was like, this is a character's talk.
Well, they were, I mean, let's be real. All of them, except for the Jackweed character, were red shirts, right? They were just all there to reinforce Liam Neeson and, kind of confront death in their own way. And then the jerk character is the only one who actually had an arc, which I thought was actually pretty interesting. After he gets put in his place, he kind of gets to this point where he just has to accept, his situation. And then he accepts that, like, look, I don't have any other reason to keep at this. So I'm just going to stop. And they really take their time on that, which was interesting. Do you think that the poem pulled through enough of it? Because the poem is really like, again, not super subtle, but it's really what is driving, like it's the theme written explicitly throughout the film.
I liked it. I liked it better than a lot of the other interhuman interactions in the movie. I kind of almost wish that there was a little more focus on it. Like everything in this movie is pretty heavy-handed, but that's fine. I think it could have been a little more lithe in its construction. I think if you cut down on,
and when we say that, I don't want people to think like Hallmark movie, but
Not to that level.
Like if you're looking for it, you can see it, but it's not like shouting it at you necessarily.
Yeah. I just kind of wish, like, I think they could have done, I mean, I'm Mr. Chop the runtime, but I mean, I think they could have done with fewer red shirts and more focus on
if we focused on like if it was the two of them, if it was the jerk guy who doesn't want to submit to authority and Liam Neeson, you think we could have built a more interesting survival story?
I think you could have had a pretty good dynamic with like 2 characters or even 3 or 4, but they just had a lot at the beginning. I don't even remember the count. But, and again, like we said, with soldier movies and as we kind of teased with Everest.
It really is like a soldier movie. It's almost like Black Hawk Down.
They almost just all blend to one another except for Liam Neeson. And
what it turns into is moments, right?
Yes, very much so. And, every film is constructed like that, but this one almost more so. Because
like the moment where that first guy dies and Liam Neeson is like looking him in the eyes, that was a good moment, right? But and there are moments like that, like when they're all telling their stories. But again, it's and like frankly, it's hard to build a story on such few elements. Although I think we'll see a very similar approach to it with Arctic. And it's going to be really interesting to compare and contrast these two, because the gray is like grabbing really hard, but it's almost trying too hard at the same time.
Yeah. I think it didn't really quite have the right focus it needed to. One of the things that I do really like about Arctic, and we'll dive into it a little bit more, is how not only how little dialogue there is and how effective it is at storytelling, but also how much that and the isolation of it leads to a form of poetry. And I think a lot of like survival films like this lead to a form of poetry just because there's no escape from the presence. Yeah. There's not a lot of bopping around between different locations. So I kind of wish they had almost focused more into the poetic motif and then just revealed the poem at the end or something like that. And then it would have felt a little less heavy-handed or something like that, or more stitched together. But, for what it's delivering, which is essentially, it feels like the reason it got made was because they were going to put Liam Neeson in the woods in snow and have him punch wolves.
Surprisingly, I think it was a pretty low-budget film. Like, it still seems like, you've got 10 studio titles at the beginning. You've got a pretty compact kind of a thing. You've got decent production quality, but it's not like a huge blockbuster.
Yeah, it feels like it's in the $1 to $5 million range, so they could afford a few wolves to
They did a pretty good job of jawsing the wolves and not overdoing their CGI wolves, because they were all
There's
CGI.
A lot of howling. There's a lot of darkness to reveal the wolves.
I just remembered my least favorite part, which is the first time Liam Neeson sees the wolves eating the body, and he goes over there to like try and get them off, and then gets attacked by wolves immediately. Like, you're the one who's supposed to know that wolves are going to attack you. Don't do that right before you have to survive.
That was an incredibly dumb moment. I didn't really understand it. I guess like what it's kind of supposed to be is that he doesn't want another human to be eaten to preserve his own humanity.
Yeah.
But in that moment, I almost would have preferred that he had made a tough survival decision and been like, hey, I'm going to just let you eat that, and then we're going to escape while you eat that guy. Because, I don't know, that would have kind of helped the theme they were kind of going for in places. And also, it would have been less stupid.
Right.
Like, why do you care that they're eating a dead guy?
And in terms of the theme, I think, and again, we'll get to Arctic in a second, but contrasting the gray and Arctic is, the gray is very thematic, and Arctic takes it almost to like the level of a parable. And I'm really interested to talk through like how, like, what are the differences that make that distinction.
But before we get to Arctic, we'll have to talk about Everest.
We have to get over Everest.
Let's get over Everest from 2015. Jason, take it away.
Everest from 2015. In 1996, the commercialization of summiting Mount Everest is in full swing, led by Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants and his rival Scott Fisher of Mountain Madness. The two businesses are each guiding climbing groups near the peak of the mountain when a blizzard suddenly arrives and obliterates the trail down to safety. This film is based on the real events of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster.
So I looked at the Wikipedia article a lot while I was watching this movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a couple of the rescue team died while they were out there rescuing people.
Oh, I wouldn't.
There were also like other expeditions besides just these two who had people die in the same set of storms.
Oh, really?
So yeah, it was a pretty deadly year on the mountain.
Yeah.
Although it was more just that it was a concentrated deadly year. So it was something like technically only like 2.9% of climbers died that year, compared to the average of 3.1% of climbers who died in a year. So technically, even though this disaster happened in 1994 or whatever, like it was a better survival rate than other years.
Wow.
Yeah, which is wild.
These are not the statistics I want to be looking at when I plan my vacations.
Well, don't go to Everest. One, it's crazy expensive. There was that one moment in there where they were talking about like how much the guy paid.
Yeah, and he just throws it out there like
it was a lot. It was like in the 5 digits, right?
$65,000, I think.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be like maybe like I would believe 6.5K.
Yeah.
But 65K? Oh my gosh. Yeah. To almost die? What? What? You could almost die for so much cheaper than that.
Speaking of Death Wish. All right, let's talk about the movie now.
This one is almost a biopic for the first half.
It's an historical biopic. It's an event biopic. Is that a thing?
Yeah.
It's not really about, I mean, it's got people in it, but it's not a biography of someone. It's a biography of a thing that happened.
Yeah, it's like if we had done Seabiscuit, but just about the one race.
But just about the race, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just about the one race, which actually could have been a bit cooler, now that I think about it. You could do some cool stuff with that. But we're not talking about horses anymore. We're talking about dying on a mountain. Yeah, so this is a fictionalized account. So this is a big thing, I will say that. This is a big thing on the mountain now, and this is kind of the start of it. The two guys who led these expeditions, the guy from New Zealand and Jake Gyllenhaal, I don't remember any names. There are too many characters. Were kind of two of the first people to really build big businesses around taking non-professionals up the mountain. Mm-hmm. A lot of these people were experienced climbers, but were also non-professionals and taking them up the mountain, providing gear, providing training, providing lodging for multiple months as you train to go up the mountain.
And when it comes down to it, no one's really experienced when you're getting that high on a mount.
Except for the Sherpas.
Yeah, except the Sherpas.
The Sherpas are super experienced.
And even that's why they don't all make it. There's another movie about that.
And one of the themes kind of presented in Everest, and one of the things discussed about Everest to this day, because it's still a thing, is how the commercialization of the mountain is irresponsible and dangerous.
Yeah.
And I'm not a mountain expert. I can't really talk to that. All I can tell you is that I've watched this movie and I've read some Wikipedia articles, and I watched the John Oliver piece about how backed up the top of Mount Everest gets during the summiting season, and how they're like the photos of people just waiting in lines to get a picture at the top of Mount Everest, and how like at a time, I think it's gotten a little better, but there's just like a lot of trash, basically people leaving flags, leaving oxygen tanks up at the top of the mountain. Bodies. Yeah, that's a thing. I think the one guy's body's still on the mountain. Mm-hmm. His wife, they were going to recover it, but his wife was like, no, he would have preferred to stay on the mountain. Yeah. So they left him up there.
I'm actually still shocked that after the book came out that the business is still going, because this is a traumatic story. I mean, even in the way that the film is presented, and I was pretty surprised, like the film is presented in such a way that it's not like a documentary, but it still is not, I don't know how to put it. It's not like overly cinemized. Like it still feels like this is how it is to go up Mount Everest. Like, it just feels like you're portraying what it is. It's not like we're not building a huge story. There are story elements that are peppered through it there, but really you're just kind of watching what happened.
It's not very Hollywoodized. It's very much just like a very polished reenactment.
Right. Yeah,
it's some Hollywood elements.
Yeah, just like huge production. It's like a really big budget production value version of Touching the Void.
Yeah, yeah. And I will say the way in which the tragedy unfolded happened to suit itself very well,
right,
to cinema, especially with like what they were able to do with like the sat phone, where like the guy was able to talk to his wife as he was stuck on the mountain. Like that was, I think that's what got this turned into a movie, was that moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does also reveal just like how difficult this is.
I know. So I think this is going to sound silly, but I feel like as a person who has recreationally climbed indoor rock climbing, I'm like, yeah, Mount Everest is hard to climb.
You're a bit of an expert.
Mount Everest is hard to climb because it's big, right? Like, no, Mount Everest is hard to climb for a whole lot of other reasons. And like, if you make one teeny tiny mistake, you just don't come back from Everest, you know?
The ice, the cold, the oxygen.
Yeah. Man, the oxygen.
The oxygen was a big source of controversy for this, actually.
Yeah.
You know how there's that
they didn't
guy,
lean into that in the film, but that's part of the story of this event.
There's some mention of it, and it's the one guy from Jake Gyllenhaal's team, Krakauer, who wrote the book that this film is based off of.
Oh, I thought Krakauer was on the Kiwis team. Rob Hall's team.
Oh,
it doesn't matter.
He's
made
the guy,
and he wrote the whole story down.
He's the guy who at one point is like, I don't use oxygen. If you have to use oxygen, you don't deserve to reach the summit. And it turns out that a lot of the controversy following that was along those lines. Some people thought that if Krakauer had used oxygen, he would have been able to save some people. But also there are a lot of people who kind of take up this other position, which is that the use of oxygen and these companies that essentially, pack the oxygen, have the Sherpas build the routes for you and guide the team up, are taking people who aren't really ready to go up Mount Everest up to this incredibly dangerous place.
Yeah.
And almost like you were saying earlier, like even after this happened and even after this movie came out, how you were a little surprised that people still go. But I think, they touch on this as part of the movie. And I think the most interesting parts of the movie are the parts that explore this, is exploring why there's this set of people who feel compelled to do it. Yeah. Everyone shouts the famous quote from the first guy who climbed the mountain of like, why would you climb the mountain? Oh, because it's there. But also like you kind of see with some of the characters that there's some other reasons that they would climb it. Like Josh Brolin's character is definitely climbing it because he suffers from depression, and the only way for him to the most reliable way it seems that he's found to escape that is to be outdoors, and he's taken it to the extreme of climbing mountains. Yeah. Well, when he said that, when he was talking about how he was he was followed by a black cloud, which is like Hollywood slang for depression. And how he only felt normal when he was climbing mountains. I was like, there's so many options to climb a mountain that don't involve almost dying on Everest. Like this is...
You could almost die in Peru.
Yeah, you could take a hike.
Yeah.
That's a thing. Yeah.
I mean, in Touching the Void, they actually start the film with this too. They start with the why. Why do we climb mountains? And theirs is a little different because they were just young guys and kind of proud of themselves and athletic, and they just said
they were trying to break a record.
We just like to do it. And that was another thing, is it was a challenge for them because that particular cliff had never been climbed before, and apparently had never been climbed since, up until the making of that film anyway. But yeah, part of it is just like an enjoyment of the physical aspect, but of course when you're talking Everest, it's less like 20 somethings with a superhero complex, and it's more like people who like have really deep-seated reasons for doing this. And and also the other guy who got funded by the school kids, And he's like, I'm just a normal guy. I don't have a family anymore. I have a community rooting for me, and I gotta, prove myself to them.
Yeah. That guy raised $60,000 from school kids, y'all.
And didn't make it back.
I don't know how I feel about taking money from kids to climb a mountain. Like it was, I know like the way that story was presented was kind of like meant to be like endearing and like, oh, I want to prove to these kids that like, just because you're like an every person doesn't mean you can't do something incredible. And I like that idea. But also, after he said he got the money from the school kids, I was immediately like, that seems sketchy. I don't know how I feel about that. If he was fundraising at like the Richie Rich private school, that's chill. But just like your average like public elementary school, I don't know, man. That feels weird.
And I realize that we're way past like spoiler territory on this film.
Oh, yeah.
But going into this film blind, like not knowing who was going to make it and who wasn't, was actually a very traumatic experience as like this guy that we've built up as like the everyman who's trying to prove himself doesn't make it. And like the guy he's been on this expedition 20 times and like he knows the way there and back and he doesn't make it. And I was like, wait, no, like there's a point where he's got to pull through, right? No, he does not. The only one that's like Beck is just like the friggin' miracle story that makes no sense.
Well, actually, I was reading up. I don't know if you read like his full story. Like he kept getting like left behind because people kept thinking he was dead.
Right.
And then like the tent fell on him. And then they were like, he's dead. The snow piled on this tent. And then he just climbed out of it again. Like he was almost unkillable at a certain point, which was crazy. He was one of those guys talking about frostbite who,
and he didn't do restorative surgery, right? As like his trophy was his frostbite almost.
I know he does talks and stuff now. I don't know too much about him currently, but yeah, if you can't tell from the way we're talking about this, because we're not talking too much about cinematic techniques, the cinematic techniques are solid. Are really solid.
The film is super well done. And again, it's not like
it's well built.
They add a few of these little thematic moments in there, but really this is just a telling of a story, of a thing that happened. There's not a lot of additive like Hollywood fluff, which is great, which is one of the things that I think makes this film really useful, especially in terms of a documentation of this event, even though it's technically a fictionalized account. But I do think that's also another interesting thing in terms of some of the deaths are complete speculation,
Well, yeah, there's like that one guy who just vanished.
Yeah, there's the guy who like there's the first guy who, the guy who got all the money from the school kids. He wants to make it to the top, so they're trying to turn him back. It's like, no, I've got to do it, which is very, very frustrating, which I think is actually something that we can touch on in a second. But he gets to the top, he comes back, and then he's like, you got to stay here, just stay here. And then he unclips himself because what's our vocab word for the day, ladies and gentlemen? Hypoxia. You don't have oxygen in your brain because they didn't have the oxygen tanks or they didn't think they had oxygen or whatever. And so he's just delirious and he unclips himself. And same thing happens with the other guy who comes to rescue the New Zealander, and he just like starts taking off his clothes and then slips off the side. But it's one of those things where it's like you just aren't thinking right, and then you slip and you fall so far.
Well, that's the really scary thing, I think. Well, one, the most fascinating part about this movie, besides just seeing the reenactment, and because we talked about how the cinematic techniques are kind of backgrounded, they're effective, they're well done, but they're not the focus, is kind of exploring these moments. And I think the reaction that a lot of people have to the idea of somebody doing something this extreme, and after you hear about a disaster like this, of just going, why, how, what? And looking into the moment by moment, the play by play of how a disaster like this could unfold.
Yeah,
how people could make decisions like this. And you see, like, one of the of the most kind of like upsetting moments for me, and it happens a few times, is when one of the climbers wants to do something really stupid, and the expedition leaders' hands are forced because they're a customer. So there's people essentially doing stuff they shouldn't be in a position for because they're on this paid expedition, which is very frustrating to watch as somebody who's rooting and hoping that everyone comes out of this alive and doesn't want anybody to die. But also at the same time, like, I guess there's no rule against getting yourself killed on a mountain, and like free will, yada, yada, yada. Like there's nothing telling you can't go die on the mountain. And I don't know how much I feel like we should be able to tell other people that they shouldn't go die on a mountain. I don't know about paying to do it, but again, those angles of it are what's kind of like presented here. And that's kind of the curiosity that I think the filmmakers took to this approach of making this movie. And that's kind of the most fascinating part for me, is these people doing this incredibly insane, risky, and fundamentally unnecessary thing, and just asking why.
And and I think part of that, even if we kind of set the financial aspects aside, is like there's this element where like the human propensity to pride is just like at the bedrock of all of this. Because even that moment that I said, like even this guy who's raised all this money from school children, he's not the big, like, Beck is the Texan. He's the big like chest puffing macho kind of guy, but he's more of a meek character, but he still has this pride. He's like, I've got to get to the top. And even though it was like not that much longer for him to get there, he makes it. But if he hadn't, probably both of them would have survived, but he just could not get over the fact that he had already failed it once or twice or whatever.
Oh, you don't. I think a fundamental part of the psychology at play here is that you don't go climb Mount Everest without some amount of pride.
Right. But this is pride conflicting with literal survival. So there's a point where like you'll do anything to survive, but then at some point there's a switch to where you're doing it for yourself, even if you're putting your own survival at jeopardy, which is a really weird thing, especially when we're looking at like Joe Simpson, who's literally doing anything to survive, and he wouldn't even let like his dignity of wetting his pants like stop him from still moving. And yet
that's like first on the list, my dude.
Right.
If you're in a survival situation, the first thing that goes out the list is the idea of being embarrassed about peeing your pants. You just do it.
Being embarrassed about not making it to the top of Mount Everest is more embarrassing, to the point that you will die for it.
Well, it's that extreme psychology that's so fascinating here. I think that's why we're interested in it. And like we've mentioned a couple times actually at this point, the idea of experiencing these survival situations that we are normally so removed from is something that makes this so fascinating. Mm-hmm. And I think there's another element at play here, especially for the people who are actually involved in these situations, where because as humans in modern society, especially in the Western world, where we're very removed from survival situations, 99.9% of the time, probably more than that for most people.
Also, for context, we both grew up in Texas, and Alex lives in sunny California. So, like, we're sitting here
very
in
well
the winter,
removed.
and it's like 40, 30 degrees here, and I'm cold.
Yeah, it was like we're very far removed from this basic survival experience. So far removed that, like, the unreality of that, I wonder how much that comes into play, where you don't even consider a possibility until you experience it. And then it's a question of whether or not you survive that, right? Like almost all of these people came from, we had climbers from New Zealand, climbers from Japan, climbers from Austria and Texas and other parts of the United States and Canada, all places that are very well off, very secure. And
well, obviously, if they're paying for
And they all clearly had 60 grand to drop on a trip here.
Yeah.
So like when you're coming from that background of security, is there part of the human psychology that's looking for danger? That's looking for that reality that you don't feel when you're in this cushioned, safe environment. And then when you are in that danger, like, do you have the wherewithal and the survival to do that, considering that all of those instincts, all those human instincts that you don't use might be essentially atrophied from the point of your birth. You know, that survival mode might not be there. And then on top of that, like, besides that, there were some and I did some further reading about some of the stuff they did, and a lot of the decisions that were made were not good. Were very not good. There's like a point at which, like, there's like a time of day at which you're allowed, or not really allowed. There's no allowing here. You're on a mountain. But there's a time of day when it's like the safest point to reach the summit. And if you summit after that, you're putting yourself in serious jeopardy because it's going to get dark and cold before you get back down to a safe point. And I think that's coming in and out of the death zone where there's no oxygen. And they summited, like, they experienced a lot of delays, and they still pushed on with the expedition and went up really late, like an hour after that latest point. And everything was slowed. And then on top of that, you know, you're already on a razor's edge, and a blizzard comes along, and that's kind of it. It's impressive that as many people survived this as they did.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, to your point of making decisions, like I remember in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and he talks about, looking into plane crashes. That's a
podcast bingo, by the way. A podcast that mentions Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers.
Is it really?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. No, but continue. It's still a valid point. It's referenced so much because it's a good book.
Right.
Continue.
So in the book that many people know of, clearly, he's looking at like what happens to make plane crashes, because planes don't crash that often, and planes don't crash themselves that often. We have the engineering down, but for a plane to crash, there's on average 7 human errors.
That's a lot of errors
before the crash happens. And usually it's communication errors, but it's kind of the same thing here. It's like you said, the death rate on Everest is 2 to 3% per year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
higher than other activities.
Mostly doable, but for something like this to happen, there are human errors. And again, at the bedrock of this is like some amount of human pride, which is all the way mixed up when you've got money going on. You've got, death is on the line. Like, you've got all this stuff going on. And that is not a good recipe when you're trying to not make mistakes and not repeatedly make mistakes, and also communicate with honesty. Again, when money's mixed up, is not a good combination.
Yeah. There is a fundamental element to survival that I think we've seen in all these movies, where it's about being honest with your limitations and your capabilities, and when to push past them and when you shouldn't. And you definitely see some of those mistakes made here.
Honestly, I was kind of shocked when Beck stopped and then went back, and he because he was built up again as like the macho guy who's going to keep going, but his vision started going, and at that point, like, you don't risk it.
The fact that he turned around then is why he didn't die. If he had gone up further, he would have been
right.
He would have died. I mean, almost certainly. And again, like, there were a bunch of other, like you're talking about with 7 mistakes. There were a lot of delays, like points where there should have been ropes and there weren't ropes. But again, like, they're building this schedule off of the idea that they're going to have people to place ropes for them. And the people who first climbed Mount Everest, they didn't have that luxury.
Yeah.
They had Sherpas, but they didn't have this organized, presented
also, let's
experience.
just point out that, like, Sherpas don't live at the top of Mount Everest. Like, they don't spend their time up there. They do it because, frankly, Westerners pay them to do it.
Yeah. Rich Western people pay them to. I don't think they'd be going up the mountain for too many lulls. I mean, some of them might, but I think they're better accustomed. I think the locals are better accustomed to how dangerous that mountain is compared to everyone else. There is an element, I will say, of people showing up to the mountain and in that base camp where it looked like people were on summer vacation or at Disneyland.
Jake Gyllenhaal's literally out there in shorts and
yeah, like you guys are playing with your lives here. This is wild.
Yeah.
And of course, at the same time, there's this element of them playing with or experiencing more traffic on the mountain every year. You see them have that one meeting in the center there where they talk about that, talk about like summiting schedules and stuff. And, you know, you read some of the articles afterwards and you realize that they knew that there was probably a storm coming and that they risked it and at a point where they shouldn't have risked it and all sorts of stuff. And it's not to cast aspersions because actual people lost their lives here, but it is kind of like examining that risk when we take the real live aspect of this, because we have two stories here today that are based on real events. And we just have to kind of ask ourselves, you know, that question of why would you put yourself in this situation?
Yeah.
Is it for bragging rights? Is it for pride? Is it because there's some fundamental like thing inside you compelling you to do it? Is it for money? You know, both team leaders are basically doing this not only because they like climbing the mountain, but also for money. So there's a lot of questions there, and we don't have perfect answers for them or certain answers for them, but they're fun to muse about. Or I shouldn't say fun. I should say interesting. Preferably, no one would die up there, but they did.
And to go back to your point about, you know, all these people coming from, you know, more or less cush backgrounds and then just trying to put themselves in that primal survival situation again.
On that global scale.
I didn't realize that John Krakauer, who wrote Into Thin Air, also wrote Into the Wild, which is about, a guy from a rich, well-to-do family. And instead of going to whatever rich college he was supposed to go to, he just like backpacks across America and then ends up in Alaska and eats the wrong berries and dies. But he was literally looking for that thrill of like, how do I get out of this environment of being
first world,
super
like,
sheltered, and find adventure or get back to some more I don't know, natural state of humanity or something.
Yeah,
but,
I don't think you'd find the same fascination with survival movies as prevalent in countries lower down the economic ladder.
Yeah.
It is kind of...
The closer it becomes to reality.
Yeah. I think that one of the things we can safely say is that the idea of a survival movie is at least in part bougie.
Yeah. I don't think Sherpas are buying tickets to Everest.
No. They're out there making a living because they have to.
But speaking of, so Everest came out in 2015, and there's a documentary from 2015, 2016 called Sherpa. And it's the documentary team went to film the unrest among the Sherpa community, who were literally being mad about not being paid well, literally the dangerous conditions that they are being put into for not being treated very well. And then
sounds like working for a Western company.
While they were shooting the documentary, there was an avalanche that killed 16 Sherpas, one of the most dangerous
I was going to say
Sherpa events. And then the whole documentary took on a new twist at that point.
Yeah. The timing of the release of this movie is pretty prescient because it was in the mid 2010s, 2014, 2015, 2016, something like that. Mm-hmm. There were like 2 years in a row that there were these massive earthquakes. And one of them was the one that the Sherpas perished in. But those were two of like I think those years out deadlied any previous year on the mountain.
Yeah. So definitely
it was like
recommend
2 years in a row too. So,
I'm gonna try and find that one and watch it. But I think that's a good pairing with this one. It's a good kind of counter dose to the voyeurism of Everest, as like much as it turns me off of Everest, but still Sherpa gives a good look at like the commercial aspect.
I think I can safely say, even without taking into like the whole travel economy first world thing. Like, I had no plans to climb Everest before this, and I don't have any plans now either. I remain unchanged. If anything, more solidified in my stance.
I know. I think I developed a fear of Everest that I probably, will never affect my life and would have never affected my life. But now I'm just scared of it. So
yeah,
thanks, Everest.
I mean, Everest is a dangerous, mighty place. I respect it. But you know what? It's doing just fine without me on it, and I'm doing just fine not being on it. So I think we're going to keep that relationship as is.
All right, Alex.
We're going to stay there.
Shall we get on our maps and escape the Arctic?
We should. Jason, take us away.
Arctic from 2018. Overgaard is awaiting rescue deep within the Arctic Circle, surviving in the remnants of his crashed plane. Finally, a helicopter responds to his distress beacon, but only to crash, leaving the pilot dead and the passenger severely wounded and unconscious. Seeing that the passenger's condition is not improving, and after finding a map with the location of a seasonal refuge a few days away, Overgaard sets out into the Arctic desert, dragging the incapacitated passenger on a sled and walking either towards hope or certain oblivion.
Yeah, all right. So I really like this movie, and it's really simple, but super effective. I mean, that's kind of like the best intro to it I can think of.
Again, it's really, I think it's really similar to the structure of The Grey, and it's going to,
it is.
I think this discussion is going to be a lot of looking at the two side by side.
Yeah. CGI bear instead of CGI wolves.
Right.
Yeah. I was surprised that bear didn't run away faster when there was a flare in its face.
I know. Yeah.
It really hung out.
It really wanted to get back in there. It's like, wait, I left my wallet.
No. Let me in that hole. Move out of the way, Mickelson.
Yeah, so again, what I really want to dive into on this one is like this element where it almost becomes a parable. We have one man trying to survive on his own. He's kind of they do a really good job of shireizing the first like 20 minutes of the film, which if you kind of catch my drift, it's like you get this sense that he has this system down. He's like, I do my SOS, I do my radio signal, I catch my fish. Like this is my home. It's not great. I'm still like in survival mode, but this is his comfort.
Yeah, this actively is his not dying
survival shire.
Yeah.
And suddenly when the helicopter comes and now he has to look after the survival of another person, he quickly realizes, oh crap, we can't both survive in my little survival shire.
Yeah, especially with you severely injured.
Yeah. We have to go to Mordor. And he has a map. He has everything. Like this is an adventure movie. And the way that we go on this journey
you, but I can carry you.
And he does. He literally has to carry her the whole way. But the map, I think, is super interesting because the map, like, anchors us in space.
It's such
in a really simple way because it doesn't matter where the map is. We don't even know exactly. Like, do we know if he's Antarctica or Alaska?
Well, there's a polar bear, so he's in the Arctic.
What? He's in the Arctic?
Yeah,
in this movie?
It's in the title. Yeah, so the North Pole, not the South Pole. There's only polar bears in the north, if anyone's wondering. Penguins in the south. He's presumably somewhere. It looks like he's probably on a landmass. So probably either the northern Canadian islands, northern Greenland, or one of the northern Scandinavian islands. Mm-hmm. Somewhere up there, out of reach. But not on the glacial like portion of the Arctic that's just a big ice sheet itself. Yeah. Because there's rocks. That's my guess. But again, it doesn't matter. Because the map clearly shows us a progress bar, and I just love it because it's so simple.
I mean, he could be on the moon. Yeah, really.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter. It's such a good like simple storytelling technique, and this movie's packed full of that. Simple but effective storytelling techniques. It really takes like this survival idea and then like deconstructs it down to like its basic elements and does each of those really well and doesn't try to overcomplicate it. And it's super effective. And speaking of stripping away elements, it's, even though it is really like wonderfully well sound designed, it could be a silent movie.
Totally, yeah.
There's like 2 lines of dialogue or something like that, but it's so effective.
They're important. I think they're thematically important lines.
Yes, because they reveal character more than they convey exposition, which is normally the goal with dialogue. If you can convey your exposition in another way, shape or form, and then keep dialogue for character development and interplay and reveal, then you're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. So again,
this movie just does it by having 2 lines of dialogue.
Right. And again, in terms of just spelling this out, we have 2 films in the Gray and Arctic where a plane crashes, people have to, the main character has to survive and keep other people alive as well. And what Arctic does is it takes away all the people except for one and makes her so incapacitated that she's not really a player except to be, I don't want to call her a MacGuffin because I don't like calling people MacGuffins. I think people elevate MacGuffin out of that. And really the map is the MacGuffin, right? Like I was thinking the fact that he has this little like outpost flag on his map where he's trying to get, but it doesn't really matter where that is like, I feel like we talked about with Land Before Time, every dinosaur movie is about, we have to get to the greener valley, the one that will have the food. And it's basically the same story here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we take away all the people, we take away all the interactions, we focus on our main character who is concerned with survival and with keeping other people alive. We strip out our threats from wolves to mostly just the cold. There is a polar bear, but that's not a pervasive threat. That is a moment.
It's like a one-off.
Yeah. It's a moment, and that's part of the kind of odyssey of the story. But we're taking all that stuff away so we can just focus on what does it mean to survive and what does it mean to survive with someone else. And I think that, ultimately it kind of paints this picture of like, if we're being a little simplistic about it, but maybe this is what they're thinking. It's like, what does it mean that we're like, as humanity, we're like on this earth and we're all just trying to survive, but we're trying to survive together. Right. Yeah. And I think there's a line where he says, he's trying to reassure her, like, you're not alone. And that's really the most important part of this is the fact that there is 2 of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the most interesting question and the thing that adds tension to every scene along the way, and it's just super effective, is the knowledge, especially the knowledge that the audience has, that this would be so much easier if he did not have to drag this injured woman along with him.
But at the same time, he never would have done it if he didn't have to drag her. Yeah,
well, yeah. Essentially, she's motivating him to survive in a way, forces him out of his essentially slow death, camping at the plane that he downed, into trying to reach for survival. And along the way, the thing in the forefront of our mind is almost every time you run into an obstacle, like the blocked pass, is
I love
like
the blocked pass.
You could just crawl over that if it was just you, but you can't get her over that, can you?
That is the most frustrating moment in the whole film is when he's on the map. He has basically a straight line to his map, and you see him, and he comes to this wall of rocks, and there's, he's got her on a sled. She's practically unconscious, and he's like, crap, you can't tell this from the map. And he's like, if I can get over this, and he gets to the top and he looks over and you can see the path. There's a valley and it's clear. It's a straight shot. And you're like, if you can get over this, you're home free. And he tries so hard for so long. And already, like, you're watching the movie and it's a movie and he's not going to be able to. But the moment when he gives up and he's like, okay, so what do I have to do now? And he reroutes the map around the thing, and he's adding 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and he scratches out the other one, and you just feel like so defeated.
It's such a good storytelling device, isn't it? Like and it really shows you like essentially what, like, because we talk about the idea of setbacks in screenwriting a lot, like how your character should face setbacks and how they address those setbacks should reveal character. And this is such a perfect example of that. Not only in like show don't tell storytelling, because almost all of that is silent, but the way in which he tries so hard to make it work, and once it doesn't, once he receives the setback, he makes the decision to keep going with her, even though it's not just a little harder, it's incredibly harder.
Yeah. You quantifiably are shown how many more days it's going to take. It's like
putting a
5
number on
times
it
harder.
helps so much. Yeah. And those numbers don't really matter to the audience, but like just like the multiplier effect, like knowing that 5 days is 5 times as long as 1 day takes care of everything we need to know there.
Yeah.
It's very effective. It's very effective. I don't know if the sum of the movie is, I don't know. I was about to say, I don't know if it's super phenomenal, but it's just so effective across the board that like it is really good. It's not as flashy as a lot of other big movies, but it is a really, really, really good one. And it's one I highly recommend.
Yeah, I'll tell you the moment that I think elevates it to the more like parable level of storytelling than the Gray is able to reach. And it's the moment when, after he has gone around the mountain, like he's done so much work to get her to safety with him. He fought the bear. He's done all of this, and now like she's fading. And he kind of nestles her away in this little cleft of a rock or whatever, and he leaves her. And you kind of understand that he's taken all the rest of the stuff on his sled, like he's going to survive for himself, right? And then immediately he falls in a cave and breaks his leg. And it's literally like a moment of divine justice saying, you can't do that. Like you've
Karma
done
really
all
bit
of
him in
this
the butt
for
there.
her. And he pulls his leg out, and now he gets back to her, and she starts coming to. And he just like immediately has this moment of regret. And that's when he starts saying, you're not alone. You're not alone. And he's basically apologizing to her. Like,
okay, now I'm starting to get what you're talking about when you're talking about this being kind of like a parable, and how like there's those divine karmic elements to it, and the whole story is built around kind of not just showing like this character, like these character moments and decisions, but also like this bigger message of
it almost imposes a morality on it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So after this, he he basically is punished for leaving her, and now he still has to carry her, but now he's limping and he's bleeding along the way. And then I think it makes the ending so much sweeter, and the ending is almost, more, I don't want to say saccharine than like the Gray. But at the point that you get there, I feel like you've earned it more.
Oh, they've definitely earned it. Yeah.
The fact that, they finally see someone. He's like, he's burning his last like piece of clothing that is going to keep him warm or whatever. Is like last ditch effort. He burns his
jacket.
And then he just lays down and he's like, you know what? We've made it as far as we could, and we're here together in it either way. Again, I think it's really about, that's the thing about having the two people there, is surviving together. That's really what the whole thing is about. And stripping away all the other elements is what brings that like little bit of clarity through the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah. I do. At first I did think we're conditioned to think this at some point, where if nobody dies in a survival movie, that it was a cop out of some kind.
Right.
But I do think you're right. I think that this was very much earned. Like he was given a specific character challenge, We thought he was going. He seemed to be abiding by it. Then he fell off the path, and he was punished. And he returned to the path, and he carried it through to the end, and thus earned the ending. Mm-hmm. And also, how lame would the ending have been if they had both died?
I know.
how unsatisfying.
Yeah.
You know, and they don't do anything like crazy. Like they don't give us some super like dialogue heavy ending where they talk afterwards or anything like that. We're not interested in that. That's not part of the story.
It's
that
probably like 30 frames of of redemption.
Yeah. Just like literally like last second of the film is, they're not going to die. Which is really nice and very satisfying. And it's perfect that they end right there. Yeah. I think this one out of the four, I think this one is my favorite. Like it is just solidly well built. And because it's a bunch of people who experienced accidents, it's not like watching someone put themselves in an unnecessarily dangerous situation. So it's not nearly as frustrating as Into the Void or Touching the Void or Everest is to a certain extent.
Slightly less exciting, but the film like breathes enough to give you that room to think through it, you know, like not necessarily being a blank slate, but almost just being a resting place for your thoughts where like each thing that's happening, you have a lot of time to think about what does this mean? What does this mean for the next thing? What does this mean about what just happened before it?
It's kind of poetic in how ponderous it is.
Yes.
I mean that in a good way.
Yeah, I know that's a different use of ponderous, but I think it's appropriate.
Yeah. I literally mean like slow enough that you have space to think like that. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not as exciting as some other films, but
it has
a really, really good one nonetheless. It does have a bear. It does have that one really big action sequence, but I see why outside of a really high energy sequence, but outside of that, like I see why it maybe doesn't have like all of the attention that something like The Grey does, where it's like, watch Liam Neeson punch a wolf. But like the Arctic is much better made. So I
love how you can accurately describe The Grey as being about Liam Neeson punching wolves, and he doesn't actually punch a wolf on screen at all.
No, yeah. It's just heavily implied.
It's basically what the film is about.
Yeah.
All right. So with all that, let's get into the overall notes about The Cold. And I think I win, Alex. The Cold sucks.
The Cold is great. Cold is great. We can do some survival stories sometime about people trapped in the heat.
We'll do the desert island episode later.
Desert. Yeah. I don't know. I prefer the winter weather to the summer. Of course, again, part of that is the fact that I'm privileged enough to live in Southern California with, you know, a climate controlled apartment and plenty of clothes and food and warm coffee.
And your husky has corrupted you.
Oh, yeah. That's another big part of it is that I've kind of just gotten, I've always liked the winter more because you sleep better in the winter, at least in North America. That tends to be the case. When it's really hot, I can't sleep. It sucks. But when it's cold, I sleep really well. So I sleep well. I have a lot of energy. I get to drink all of my favorite things that are all warm drinks. And my dog really likes the cold weather, so she wants to go on 5 walks a day when it's cold. And I just get really used to the cold. So now I am not nearly as sensitive to it. And also the cold I experience is like 30 degrees or 40 degrees, not negative 30. So it's a little different. But yeah, I just don't like the pain. Cold.
My fingers hurt. My nose hurts. My toes hurt.
It's so weird to hear you talk about that and you're in Texas.
I know.
It's like 45 degrees out, my dude.
I know. It's like we get like relatively cold for like maybe a month. Maybe. It's like a few days out of the winter that get really cold. But I don't like it. So I'm happy. All right. But about the films that we're talking about, like I said at the beginning, we kind of have balanced the films between like circumstantial kind of survival films and, as Alex would say, you know, just being dumb kind of survival films.
Yeah. You put yourself in this situation versus the situation put you in it.
Ironically, the two real stories that we covered are the ones where they put themselves in that situation. And the two fictional stories are the ones where the plane crashed, which again, doesn't really happen that often. And the one real story of a plane crash that was turned into a movie, we intentionally decided to not cover. Y'all can go watch the cannibal movie on your own.
Yeah, they eat some butt, and we mean that literally. They
literally joked about that in The Gray. Did you catch that?
Yes, I did. Yeah. It was, you ever talk to your friends about if it's stranded somewhere, who would eat the other one first? Yeah, watch Alive or whatever that movie's called.
Yeah. But this is part of a larger set of survival films. I like a few that I was thinking of specifically, especially with The Gray, because The Gray was about, what does it take for you to survive? Like, what do you have to have going for you to go back to your life when you've gone through that much? And I felt like that was a lot of the same themes in Gravity. And I didn't find Gravity a very satisfying movie because I didn't feel like she had very much reason to keep fighting, and yet she just kept going, which is kind of the point. Like, I felt like The Gray, I don't know, was more exciting, or I don't know, maybe just more intense and Liam Neeson-y. But it was more entertaining than Gravity to me.
I think Gravity struggles to hit that that primal sense of survival when you're in a sci-fi space setting.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. Like you're so removed from that primal sense of survival. That's a little different. But something else that kind of fits with the group of survivors trying to survive something insane, but are slowly being picked off one by one, is a movie like Annihilation. Where very Grey-like, somebody with a haunted past goes and does something that should kill them and slowly picks off the group one by one. Spoilers, I guess, but reaches the end and has some kind of self-relevant metaphor ending thing happen. It's been a while since I've seen that movie. I liked it though.
The Gray also, is on the borderline between survival and monster film, which monster films can become like a survival film. Like Alien and Aliens are both on that survival monster line.
Yeah. Technically, almost every horror slasher movie is a survival movie to some extent.
Right. It's
especially
just
when
less
they're bottled.
Right. It's just the kind of the extent to which you can encapsulate it. So like in Alien and Aliens, it's like we have a set crew on a ship and they're all going to die. And in these films, like they're stranded somewhere very remote. Whereas depending on how you do the horror movie, you can be more surrounded by society or less. Like Jaws is less a survival film and more of a monster film because not every single person in that town is going to die.
There's not that element of redshirting.
Right.
Survival movies, I mean, there's a lot of them. I think we dived into something really pertinent when we were talking about how this kind of genre really appeals, especially when it's in a very real setting, like Everest, kind of appeals more to kind of like a first world, more bougie audience. Something like Gravity or Annihilation is so sci-fi that it has a broader appeal and from that sci-fi genre, like aspect of portraying unreality. But the thought of people slowly dying off being found entertaining is definitely one hatched in a society in which that is not commonly a possibility.
Yeah. I just remembered the other survival film that we have already covered that I was reminded of.
Boat?
Yes, Arctic reminds me a lot of All Is Lost with Robert Redford, where it's just him on his little dinghy and it like capsizes or whatever. But it's just him out on the water trying to survive for the whole movie. It was very similar. But let's talk about what's coming up. We've got a little bit of changes going on, a little bit of new stuff for next year. So this is our last podcast for 2022, and in 2023,
well, the structure is going to be changing a little bit because we're not going to be going. We're still going to be producing a monthly episode, but those episodes will be strung together into larger courses, if you will, where we dissect topics across a larger and bigger scope. And each episode is going to be diving in to different aspects, different eras, different film movements that all compromise the same idea. So
if you've liked our series on like the World Tour or the World War II series, it's going to be similar to that, but just more consistently, things that all go together.
Yeah. We're going to offer you a charcuterie plate of matching film cheeses and fruits. And the first course will be Westerns. We're going to be spending the first 5 episodes of 2023 talking about Westerns. We're going to be talking about Westerns from the beginning ages of Hollywood, when it was a convenient source of material to make into movies and took off into big mega stars. Some of the first mega Hollywood stars were all cowboys. We're going to talk about how it entered the sound era with John Ford. In another episode, we'll be talking about how Westerns influenced films made in Japan in the mid 20th century that kind of became like the new era Chambara samurai films, how those films then in turn influenced American films and Italian spaghetti Westerns, and then where the Western itself has ended up in the modern day with a very interesting selection of films. And as it often is when you're in the midst of history and not looking at it in arrears, no clear trajectory forward. But hopefully by the end of it, everyone who participates in the Western course should have a pretty firm understanding of the history of the genre, different movements within it. Hopefully you'll see a lot of cool films that you hadn't heard of before, or you have heard of before, and you get to hear us talk about it. So yeah, go check it out. Tell a friend to check it out. And hang out there for in our Discord for conversations about those movies and other Westerns that we'll explore on the side throughout the first half of 2023.
Yeah, and part of that focus on the series will mean kind of a move away from some of the Patreon stuff, which we're going to be kind of putting on hold for as of now, an indefinite period of time. Yeah. But yeah, the Discord will be open. We'll be talking about Western movies for the next 6 months or so. So jump in there. Let us know what your favorite Western is, and check out some of the episodes we've already done on Westerns to get prepped.
Exactly. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 450, which is a great number to end the year on, films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter at thefilmlings.
Summaries for each of the films this episode were recorded by me, Jason Harden. You can find me online on Twitter at TheBlueJay1994.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Welcome to Podcast Land, the land of podcasts.
We have mics.
We have mics and opinions and not much else. Anyway, continue.